cancel the medical transfer, and have the private secretary wait outside. That's all it took. 11 words. Normal volume. A corridor in the east wing of Buckingham Palace, about 4 in the afternoon, and the entire floor stopped moving. The whole building understood what it meant. Behind one of those heavy wooden doors, someone was sitting in darkness, curtains drawn, telephone diverted, meals going in on silver trays and coming back out mostly untouched. For 2 days, this person had disappeared from view. And when 11 words echoed down that corridor, spoken quietly but with absolute certainty, everyone within earshot knew something fundamental had just shifted. Let's take a moment to understand what actually unfolded in this story, because the version most people know is missing the part that actually matters. This isn't really a story about illness, it's a story about power. It's about what happens when someone tries to use a piece of paper, specifically words that were never supposed to be there, to decide what another person is allowed to do. On this particular occasion, the tension had been building for weeks. At that point in time, the situation was already fragile. King Charles had decided to do something he'd wanted to do for decades: shrink the royal machine, control the money differently, make every household account for every penny, and he'd chosen his sister, Princess Anne, to run it. This choice tells you everything about what he thought the problem was. Anne is 75 years old. She carried out 478 public engagements in 2025. That's more actual work days than almost anyone else in that family, and she does it without a personal press team, without a stylist, and famously without changing outfits she's decided still fit. Journalists tracking her coverage have noted she's been photographed in the same coat across 4 decades. That woman going through household accounts line by line. Everyone inside that building understood. It wasn't punishment, it was the end of something. What many people don't know is what was being protected in those household accounts. Over 20 years, the Queen had built something inside those walls that has no name and doesn't appear on any organization chart. Private staff, a communications operation of her own, discretionary payments to people who do things nobody has ever asked to describe in writing. Allowances that go out to people under headings that would take an auditor about 4 hours to unpick and 4 minutes to query. None of that is illegal. Every large household has some version of it. Hers was just the largest, and it existed entirely because of one marriage. A single point of control meant every payment would cross one desk, and that desk belonged to a woman who has spent 50 years declining to be impressed by anybody. The threshold they were talking about was £5,000. Anything above it needed a second signature. That number sounds generous until someone who actually knows those accounts explains what lives underneath it. Almost nothing routine in that building costs £5,000. Roofs, cars, security, those already go through proper channels. £5,000 is where the discretionary money lives. Anne's office had run a test first. They looked at one household's figures and found something interesting. In a single year, 14 separate arrangements sat between £4,000 and £5,000 each. 14 payments, none individually large enough to flag. All of them landing right under a line that did not exist yet. Nobody has ever suggested that was deliberate. It also stopped happening the week the threshold was circulated. She tried the ordinary route first. She went to her husband and made an argument, not a scene, not an ultimatum. An argument of the kind two people who've been together a long time make about a practical matter. The argument was that his sister was 75, that she already worked harder than anyone in the family, and that adding household accounts to a diary that was already full was unkind and would end badly. She suggested the oversight sit with her own office instead. She was in the building every day. She knew the staff. Continuity mattered more than austerity. Every part of that was sensible. If a stranger read the transcript, they'd think it was good advice. Charles said no, more than once. By the second week, the thing had stopped being a discussion and become a decision that had already been taken. The building runs on something called the Keeper of the Privy Purse. It's a real office with a real holder, and it's existed since the 16th century. It's the closest thing this institution has to a finance director. Every household inside the building has spent generations working out how to deal with this office in ways that produce the answer they want. The change Charles was proposing didn't abolish that office. It put a member of the royal family above it with a veto. That's the whole change, and it's why it mattered so much. An official can be persuaded, outranked, waited out, or gone around. A princess of the blood, who has decided your allowance is unnecessary, cannot be any of those things. The private secretaries understood the change quickest. By the middle of that week, 2 of them had quietly asked for meetings about things they suddenly wanted on the record. 2 private secretaries asking for meetings in the same week is not normal in that building. One of them wanted a note in the file recording that a standing arrangement in his own household had been set up before his time, on verbal instruction, and that he'd never seen written authority for it. That's what people do when they can see an audit coming. They don't destroy anything. They write a short, polite, dull memorandum establishing that whatever is about to be found was not their idea. 4 of those memoranda were filed in the 10 days before everything changed. Every one is a small piece of evidence that a great many people inside that building knew exactly what Anne was going to find. Then the Queen began to look unwell. This is the part where the story gets careful, because the whole thing turns on getting this right, and because the sloppy version that went around online gets it badly wrong. She did not invent an illness. Nobody has ever produced anything to suggest she did. People around her noticed a change over about 10 days. She looked pale at internal briefings. She'd stopped coming to 2 of the standing meetings she normally chairs. She spoke more quietly. She left a lunch early. Somebody who has worked in that household for 19 years said afterwards that she looked like somebody running on nothing. That woman is 79 years old. She's been the second most photographed person in every room she's entered for 2 decades. She'd spent the previous 18 months watching her husband go through medical treatment in public while carrying his diary as well as her own. Anybody in that position could be exhausted. Most people in that position would be. That is the fair version, and it holds all the way through this story. The letter arrived from a private clinic in Chelsea on a Friday afternoon. It was on headed paper, signed by a consultant with a long and entirely respectable list of letters after his name. It went to the King's private office and described what seemed like a straightforward diagnosis: exhaustion of a clinical kind, with accompanying low mood, arrived at after assessment. The recommendation was rest and a reduced schedule for a period of weeks. Every word of that is ordinary. Letters like it go out of private clinics in London 100 times a week. Company directors get them. Judges get them. People who present the weather get them. There is nothing remarkable about a single line of it, except one paragraph. The paragraph sat near the end, after the recommendation and before the sign-off. It did something that the rest of the letter did not do. It talked about her job. It said that any sudden restructuring of the patient's household responsibilities or removal of her established administrative role would be likely to cause a significant setback to recovery. Maintaining her existing oversight of household matters would provide the routine and sense of purpose that recovery depends on. 31 words in the operative part. Read them again and notice what they are not. They are not a description of a patient. Not a diagnosis, prognosis, treatment, or medication. They are an instruction to a third party about an administrative decision, sitting inside a clinical document, wearing a doctor's signature. Behind closed doors, the tone was far more serious than anyone outside that building understood. Charles read it on the Friday evening, and he stopped everything. You have to understand what that letter did to that particular man, because it was aimed at him with real precision, and it hit exactly where it was aimed. He is 77. He's spent his own last 2 years in and out of treatment in public, with the whole country reading updates about him. He knows precisely what it is to be the person in the room whose diary everybody else is quietly managing. He has spent a very large part of his adult life being told by newspapers and by his own family that his judgment about the woman he married is not to be trusted. Put a letter in front of that man saying his wife will be harmed if he goes ahead, and there is no version of him that signs on Friday. He cancelled the signing. He did not reschedule it. He went upstairs for the next 2 days. People who were on that floor describe him coming down for 20 minutes at a time and going straight back up. He cancelled 2 engagements himself, which he almost never does. By the Sunday evening, the household had begun drafting a bulletin. A queen who has not been seen for 2 days generates questions by about the 3rd one. The wording of a bulletin like that is a science in that building, and it's been for a century. The draft said the queen was resting on medical advice. Engagements for the coming fortnight had been postponed. Her Majesty was grateful for the messages received. 2 lines. Every word of it argued over by 4 people. Diana's health was described in bulletins out of that same office for years, and every one of them was written by people who hadn't been in a room with her that week. The reason this one never went out is the reason it was being written at all. The moment that bulletin left the building, the illness stopped being a family matter and became a public fact. And public facts are extremely difficult to reverse. Somebody in the king's office wanted to wait 1 more day. That decision saved everybody involved from something they haven't fully appreciated yet. If that bulletin had gone out on the Sunday, everything that happened on Tuesday would have had to happen in front of the entire country. There was also a second document being prepared. Someone in her office had drafted a temporary instrument, not the full transfer, nothing permanent, just a short interim arrangement so that nothing seized up while she recovered. The covering note used the plural clinicians. There was 1 letter and 1 signature on it. Charles was ready to sign the interim instrument on Tuesday afternoon. Everybody around him has said the same thing about his state of mind. He was not being manipulated in any way he could have identified. He was a tired man who had been handed a piece of paper saying the alternative would hurt his wife. Anne had been given a copy of the clinic letter on the Saturday morning because she was the person whose appointment it had cancelled. Somebody had the sense to send it to her. She did not ring anybody. She did not go to her brother. She read it, and then she read it again. Then she did the thing that has made that woman the most quietly dangerous person in that institution for 50 years. She looked at the object rather than the argument. The letter is 2 pages. The paragraph in question sits on the 2nd page, and on a printed copy held up under decent light, the typeface in that paragraph does not match the rest of the document, not dramatically. The spacing between the lines is fractionally tighter. The apostrophes lean the wrong way. It is the specific mismatch you get when a block of text has been written somewhere else and pasted into a document, and nobody has bothered to clean up the formatting because nobody expected anybody to look. That is the entire clue, a tiny piece of typography. She said nothing about it for 3 days. Walking into her brother's study on the Saturday of a health crisis, holding a letter and a theory about apostrophes, would have ended her involvement in this permanently. It would have looked exactly like what her sister-in-law had been telling him it was, a woman who wanted the job and would not let it go. She needed a reason to go and ask a question, and the reason walked past her study door on Tuesday afternoon. One more piece matters for understanding why Anne, of all people, was never going to let this go. Anne watched her brother's first marriage from a closer distance than anybody except the 2 people inside it. She watched what a household does when it decides a story about somebody. She watched Diana be described for years by perfectly reasonable people in imperfectly reasonable language. Unstable, difficult, not coping, needs managing. Not one of those documents was ever shown to Diana. Not one of them was ever signed by anybody who could be asked about it afterwards. Anne has never spoken about that period publicly. On the record is her behavior ever since. She does not accept a characterization of a person from a piece of paper without finding out who wrote it. 30 years earlier, a description had been used to take things away from a woman in that family. She was now holding a description being used to keep things. Prince Louis was at the residence that afternoon. His parents were at a reception in central London, and an 8-year-old on a half-term Tuesday has to be somewhere. He was looking for his great-aunt. Those two get on, which surprises people who only know Anne from photographs. It stops surprising anybody who's watched her with small children for more than 4 minutes. She talks to them like adults, and she has horses. He came along the upper corridor past the private sitting rooms. He did not stop, hide, or listen at a door. He walked past a door that was not properly shut, and he heard his step-grandmother laughing. That is all. That is the whole of what an 8-year-old contributed to this. He got to Anne's study, sat down on the arm of a chair the way children do, and said something completely ordinary in the middle of something else. He said that Granny Camilla sounded better because she was laughing on the telephone and walking about. Watch what Anne did with that, because this is the part that matters, and it is the opposite of what the internet says she did. She did not treat it as evidence. A woman who has been signed off for exhaustion can laugh on a telephone. A woman recovering from a bad fortnight can walk about her own room. The boy's remark did something much smaller than that, and much more useful. It told her that the person in that room was well enough to hold a conversation. And a patient well enough to hold a conversation is a patient well enough to have been asked whether she wanted a paragraph about her job put into her own medical letter. One more thing about that afternoon matters for a practical reason. The protection officer was in the room. He heard the boy say it as well. At no point after Tuesday did anybody have to ask an 8-year-old to repeat anything or confirm anything. He said one sentence to his great-aunt about somebody sounding better in front of an adult witness, and then he was taken to the kitchen and given something to eat. Nobody in that study ever mentioned his name. Anne went down to her car and told her protection officer where they were going. They were outside the building in Chelsea inside half an hour. What that looks like from inside a private clinic on an ordinary Tuesday is this. A woman walks in unannounced with one officer behind her. The receptionist is 24 and has never met anybody remotely like this. Anne asked politely, without raising her voice, for the consultant by name. Then she waited. Standing up in a waiting room with 2 other patients in it for 11 minutes because he was with somebody and she was not going to interrupt a consultation. 11 minutes with a copy of a country magazine on the table. She has done this before at other institutions over other things. People who have worked with her describe it as the single most effective thing in her repertoire. She does not shout. She does not announce herself. She does not leave. 2 other patients were in that waiting room. One of them, a woman in her 60s waiting for a follow-up, said afterwards that she'd spent 4 of those 11 minutes trying to work out whether she was imagining it, and the other 7 wondering whether to say anything and deciding not to. Anne read a country magazine. She did not use her telephone once. The receptionist offered to see whether the consultant could be interrupted. Anne said there was no need, and sat back down. That is not modesty. It is method. A person who insists on being seen immediately gives the other side 5 minutes to prepare, and 5 minutes is all most people need. The consultant came out and took her into his office. He is not a fraudster, and there is no Swiss bank account in this story. He is a man in his 50s with a long career, a busy private list, and a reputation he has spent 30 years building. He had done something much more ordinary than a crime. Anne asked him one question. "Did you write the second paragraph on page 2? He said no. Not immediately, and not comfortably. Then he got up and went to a filing cabinet. He came back with a printed email chain that he had kept, which tells you he had been uneasy about this for a fortnight. The paragraph had arrived at the clinic already written. It came in at 11:09 on Thursday morning, from an address inside the Queen's private office. The body of the email was 4 lines long and entirely polite. It said the household had prepared suggested wording for the closing section of the letter and would be grateful to see it reflected. The household understood the clinical content remained entirely a matter for the consultant. Under it, in a separate block, sat 31 words. The same 31 words that came off the printer 3 days later on clinic paper over a doctor's signature in slightly the wrong typeface. He had queried it. That's on the chain as well, and it finished the argument before it started because he had put his objection in writing himself. He wrote back that afternoon saying the suggested wording went beyond what he could properly certify. The specific arrangement of the patient's duties was outside his competence to comment on. He would prefer to describe the need for rest in general terms. The reply came back inside 40 minutes. It thanked him. It said the wording had already been discussed and agreed at the appropriate level. The household would be grateful if the letter could go out in the agreed form by Friday. Discussed and agreed at the appropriate level. 9 words doing an enormous amount of work. No name, no date, no meeting. Impossible to check by a man in Chelsea with a full list and a letter to get out. He put the paragraph in. Anne asked him why, and his answer is the most honest thing anybody says in this entire story. He said he assumed somebody senior had cleared it. Pushing back a second time would have meant a fight with a royal household over a form of words. He had a waiting room full of people, that is it. That is the whole of the machinery. No bribe, no conspiracy, no money moving anywhere. One tired professional, one polite email he could not verify, one paragraph he did not believe in, put into a document because arguing about it was going to cost him an afternoon he did not have. Anne asked whether he would come and say that to the king. He asked whether he had a choice. She said he did. If he preferred, she would take the printed chain herself and he would hear about it later. In her experience, it was better to be the person in the room than the person being described in it. He got his coat. She had him back at the palace by 4. She took him in through the side entrance because a man in a suit carrying a folder through the front of that building at that hour becomes a story by 6. Anne came up the corridor in the east wing where a private secretary was already waiting outside the study with the interim instrument in a folder ready for a signature that afternoon. She opened her brother's door, went in, and closed it behind her with a consultant physician standing in the room. Charles had spent 4 days believing something specific about the week he was having. He was about to stop believing it in front of a stranger. He looked up and asked her, apparently quite gently, whether it could wait. She said it could not. The paragraph in the letter had not been written by any doctor. The man standing next to her had been sent it in an email from his wife's office 3 days before it appeared over his signature. He had the printout. Then she stood back and let the consultant speak. This is the single most important thing in this whole file. She did not present it herself. She had the person who could be questioned do the talking in front of the person entitled to question him. It took about 40 minutes. The consultant walked the king through the chain. The original email at 11:09. His own objection. The reply. The final letter. He was careful several times to say the thing that mattered most. The thing that has been lost in every retelling since. The illness was real. She was exhausted, and she was low, and both findings were mine. He had assessed her himself. He stood by every clinical word in that document. The only part of it he had not written was the part about her job. Charles did not say anything for a long time. Somebody who was in the room said the king put both hands flat on the desk and looked at them, and that what was on his face was not anger. 30 years earlier, a version of this had happened in the same building to a different woman. The whole country had eventually found out about it. The man sitting at that desk had spent the rest of his life being asked why nobody stopped it. A description of a woman written by somebody who was not in the room with her had been used to decide what she was allowed to hold. The difference this time was the direction it was pointing. Before that, One detail from the study that nobody has been able to explain. Charles asked the consultant one question of his own before he sent for his wife, and it was not about the email. He asked whether, in his clinical judgment, taking the household accounts away from her would have harmed her at all. The consultant said no. The opposite, in fact. He said that in his experience, a patient in that condition benefits from having less to hold rather than more. If anybody had asked him what he would recommend, he would have recommended she be relieved of exactly the responsibility the paragraph was written to preserve. The king sat with that for a moment and then said, "Thank you. 2 decades of watching a family manage a woman through paperwork, and the one time somebody in that building thought to ask a doctor for his own opinion." The answer turned out to be the reverse of the document. He sent for her at about 10:05. She came down still in character. That detail has been given by 4 people, and it is the hardest one in the file. Slowly, a hand on the wall at the turn of the stairs, dressing gown over a nightdress, one of her women half a step behind in case she needed an arm. She got 3 or 4 words out about the doctors saying she should not be up. Then she saw the consultant standing beside Anne. Everybody who describes that moment describes the same sequence. She stops walking. The hand comes off the wall, and her face does the thing that woman has spent 20 years making certain no camera ever gets nothing at all for slightly too long. Charles told her the consultant had been through the correspondence with him. She said the pressure had been unbearable. She wanted to protect the household through a difficult period. She said Anne had been working on him for months. He asked her one question. It is the only thing he said in the whole exchange that anybody has repeated word for word. "Did you know the paragraph was going to be sent?" She did not answer it. That is the entire climax of this story. Not a confession, not a scene, not a shouted accusation. A question about an email, and a silence in a study in front of a man from a clinic in Chelsea, who was standing there wishing he were anywhere else on earth. Anne stepped forward with the instrument that had been in the diary for the previous Friday. Charles had signed it about 10 minutes before his wife came downstairs. Every discretionary budget assigned to the Queen's office revoked. Every private allowance under that office suspended pending review. Control of the private purse with Anne permanently. No interim arrangement. No review date. The private communications operation dissolved. The staff offered redeployment inside the main household. She would not be sleeping in that building. She left for Raymill House that evening. Raymill is hers. She bought it in Wiltshire in 1995 before any of it. She kept it after the marriage and has always kept it. She goes there most weekends. It is the one address in her life that has never had anything to do with him. She went there at 7 o'clock in the evening, in the rain, in a dark coat, out through the side entrance rather than the front. The humiliation is not the car, and it is not the rain, it is the corridor. The private secretary was still standing outside that study at 10:07, with the folder under his arm. He had been there since 4 o'clock. Nobody had told him he could go because nobody had thought about him at all. He was still holding the interim instrument that would have given her the household when she walked past him on her way out. Neither of them said anything. The consultant went back to work on Wednesday morning and saw a full list. Nothing happened to him. No regulator opened anything because on the evidence he did not falsify a clinical finding. He included a paragraph outside his competence, having said in writing that it was outside his competence, having been told it had been agreed above him. His practice manager left the following month. That is the only career in this story that ended. She had done nothing except forward an email from a royal household to the consultant it was addressed to, which is her entire job. Nothing was announced. Nothing needed to be. The story emerged over weeks. 2 correspondents noticed the absence inside a day. No bulletin about a queen who had been unwell enough to disappear for 4 days was noticed by more of them the day after that. By the weekend, the outline was in 3 papers, and the outline was close enough to correct to have come from somebody who had been on that floor. The palace said nothing at all, which is standard, and works about half as well as it used to. What became clear later was deeply unsettling. For 15 years, a woman in that same building had been described in documents she was never shown. Documents written by people who were not in the room with her. Unstable, difficult, not coping, needs managing. Every one of those descriptions had been used to decide something about her. Not one was ever signed by anybody who could be asked about it afterwards. Diana never got to see a single one of those pages. Somebody in that palace put 31 words about a woman into a doctor's letter 30 years later. And this time, a member of that family picked the page up, looked at the typeface, and went and found out who wrote it. She spent 20 years building the only thing in that palace that was hers rather than his. Staff she chose, budgets she controlled. An operation nobody outside her office could see into. And she lost every single piece of it in one afternoon, because somebody in that office wanted the wording tidied and could not be bothered to write it themselves. They sent a man in Chelsea 31 words about a job that was never any of his business. In that family, the paper always outlives the person who wrote it. Everybody there knows it. Everybody there behaves as though they have forgotten. An email at 11:09 on a Thursday morning, 4 lines, extremely polite, sent